Part III. Swann in Love, Section 24. The name of Bougival had suggested to him that of another place in the same district, Bouzeville, which carried also, bound to it by a hyphen, a second name, to wit, Brodté, which he had often seen on maps, but without ever previously remarking that it was the same name as that borne by his friend Monsieur de Brodté, whom the anonymous letter accused of having been Odette's lover. After all, when it came to Monsieur de Brodté, there was nothing improbable in the charge; but so far as Madame Verdurin was concerned, it was a sheer impossibility. From the fact that Odette did occasionally tell a lie, it was not fair to conclude that she never by any chance told the truth; and in these bantering conversations with Madame Verdurin, which she herself had repeated to Swann, he could recognize those meaningless and dangerous pleasantries which, in their inexperience of life and ignorance of vice, women often utter, thereby certifying their own innocence; who, as for instance Odette, would be the last people in the world to feel any undue affection for one another. Whereas, on the other hand, the indignation with which she had scattered the suspicions which she had unintentionally brought into being, for a moment, in his mind by her story, fitted in with everything that he knew of the tastes, the temperament of his mistress. But at that moment, by an inspiration of jealousy, analogous to the inspiration which reveals to a poet or a philosopher, who has nothing so far but an odd pair of rhymes or a detached observation, the idea or the natural law which will give power, mastery to his work, Swann recalled for the first time a remark which Odette had made to him at least 2 years before. "Oh, Madame Verdurin, she won't hear of anything just now but me. I'm a love, if you please, and she kisses me, and wants me to go with her everywhere and call her by her Christian name." So far from seeing in these expressions any connection with the absurd insinuations, intended to create an atmosphere of vice, which Odette had since repeated to him, he had welcomed them as a proof of Madame Verdurin's warm-hearted and generous friendship. But now this old memory of her affection for Odette had coalesced suddenly with his more recent memory of her unseemly conversation. He could no longer separate them in his mind, and he saw them blended in reality, the affection imparting a certain seriousness and importance to the pleasantries which in return spoiled the affection of its innocence. He went to see Odette. He sat down, keeping at a distance from her. He did not dare to embrace her, not knowing whether in her, in himself, it would be affection or anger that a kiss would provoke. He sat there silent, watching their love expire. Suddenly he made up his mind. "Odette, my darling," he began, "I know I am being simply odious, but I must ask you a few questions. You remember what I once thought about you and Madame Verdurin? Tell me, was it true? Have you, with her or any one else, ever?" She shook her head, pursing her lips together, a sign which people commonly employ to signify that they are not going, because it would bore them to go, when some one has asked, "Are you coming to watch the procession go by, or will you be at the review?" But this shake of the head, which is thus commonly used to decline participation in an event that has yet to come, imparts for that reason an element of uncertainty to the denial of participation in an event that is past. Furthermore, it suggests reasons of personal convenience rather than any definite repudiation, any moral impossibility. When he saw Odette thus make him a sign that the insinuation was false, he realized that it was quite possibly true. "I have told you, I never did. You know quite well," she added, seeming angry and uncomfortable. "Yes, I know all that. But are you quite sure? Don't say to me, 'You know quite well.' Say, 'I have never done anything of that sort with any woman.'" She repeated his words like a lesson learned by rote, and as though she hoped thereby to be rid of him. "I have never done anything of that sort with any woman." "Can you swear it to me? On your Laghetto medal?" Swann knew that Odette would never perjure herself on that. "Oh, you do make me so miserable!" she cried, with a jerk of her body, as though to shake herself free of the constraint of his question. "Have you nearly done? What is the matter with you to day? You seem to have made up your mind that I am to be forced to hate you, to curse you. Look, I was anxious to be friends with you again, for us to have a nice time together, like the old days, and this is all the thanks I get?" However, he would not let her go, but sat there like a surgeon who waits for a spasm to subside that has interrupted his operation, but need not make him abandon it. "You are quite wrong in supposing that I bear you the least ill will in the world, Odette," he began with a persuasive and deceitful gentleness. "I never speak to you except of what I already know, and I always know a great deal more than I say. But you alone can mollify by your confession what makes me hate you so long as it has been reported to me only by other people. My anger with you is never due to your actions, I can and do forgive you everything because I love you, but to your untruthfulness, the ridiculous untruthfulness which makes you persist in denying things which I know to be true. How can you expect that I shall continue to love you when I see you maintain, when I hear you swear to me a thing which I know to be false? Odette, do not prolong this moment which is torturing us both. If you are willing to end it at once, you shall be free of it forever. Tell me, upon your medal, yes or no, whether you have ever done those things." "How on earth can I tell?" She was furious. "Perhaps I have, ever so long ago, when I didn't know what I was doing, perhaps 2 or 3 times." Swann had prepared himself for all possibilities. Reality must, therefore, be something which bears no relation to possibilities, any more than the stab of a knife in one's body bears to the gradual movement of the clouds overhead, since those words 2 or 3 times carved, as it were, a cross upon the living tissues of his heart. A strange thing, indeed, that those words, 2 or 3 times, nothing more than a few words, words uttered in the air at a distance, could so lacerate a man's heart, as if they had actually pierced it, could sicken a man like a poison that he had drunk. Instinctively Swann thought of the remark that he had heard at Madame de Saint Ouvert's, "I have never seen anything to beat it since the table turning." The agony that he now suffered in no way resembled what he had supposed. Not only because, in the hours when he most entirely mistrusted her, he had rarely imagined such a culmination of evil, but because, even when he did imagine that offense, it remained vague, uncertain, was not clothed in the particular horror which had escaped with the words perhaps 2 or 3 times, was not armed with that specific cruelty, as different from anything that he had known as a new malady by which one is attacked for the first time. And yet this Odette, from whom all this evil sprang, was no less dear to him, was on the contrary more precious, as if in proportion as his sufferings increased, there increased at the same time the price of the sedative, of the antidote which this woman alone possessed. He wished to pay her more attention, as one attends to a disease which one discovers suddenly to have grown more serious. He wished that the horrible thing which she had told him she had done 2 or 3 times might be prevented from occurring again. To ensure that, he must watch over Odette. People often say that by pointing out to a man the faults of his mistress, you succeed only in strengthening his attachment to her, because he does not believe you. Yet how much more so if he does? But, Swann asked himself, how could he manage to protect her? He might perhaps be able to preserve her from the contamination of any one woman, but there were hundreds of other women, and he realized how insane had been his ambition when he had begun, on the evening when he had failed to find Odette at the Verderons', to desire the possession, as if that were ever possible, of another person. Happily for Swann, beneath the mass of suffering which had invaded his soul like a conquering horde of barbarians, there lay a natural foundation, older, more placid, and silently laborious, like the cells of an injured organ, which at once set to work to repair the damaged tissues, or the muscles of a paralyzed limb, which tend to recover their former movements. These older, these autochthonous indwellers in his soul, absorbed all Swann's strength, for a while, in that obscure task of reparation, which gives one an illusory sense of repose during convalescence, or after an operation. This time it was not so much, as it ordinarily was, in Swann's brain that the slackening of tension due to exhaustion took effect. It was rather in his heart. But all the things in life that have once existed tend to recur, and, like a dying animal that is once more stirred by the throes of a convulsion, which was, apparently, ended, upon Swann's heart, spared for a moment only, the same agony returned of its own accord to trace the same cross again. He remembered those moonlit evenings, when, leaning back in the victoria that was taking him to the Rue La Pérouse, he would cultivate with voluptuous enjoyment the emotions of a man in love, ignorant of the poisoned fruit that such emotions must inevitably bear. But all those thoughts lasted for no more than a second, the time that it took him to raise his hand to his heart, to draw breath again, and to contrive to smile, so as to dissemble his torment. Already he had begun to put further questions. For his jealousy, which had taken an amount of trouble, such as no enemy would have incurred, to strike him this mortal blow, to make him forcibly acquainted with the most cruel pain that he had ever known, his jealousy was not satisfied that he had yet suffered enough, and sought to expose his bosom to an even deeper wound. Like an evil deity, his jealousy was inspiring Swann, was thrusting him on towards destruction. It was not his fault, but Odette's alone, if at first his punishment was not more severe. "My darling," he began again, "it's all over now. Was it with any one I know?" "No, I swear it wasn't. Besides, I think I exaggerated. I never really went as far as that." He smiled, and resumed with, "Just as you like. It doesn't really matter, but it's unfortunate that you can't give me any name. If I were able to form an idea of the person, that would prevent my ever thinking of her again. I say it for your own sake, because then I shouldn't bother you any more about it. It's so soothing to be able to form a clear picture of things in one's mind. What is really terrible is what one cannot imagine. But you've been so sweet to me. I don't want to tire you. I do thank you with all my heart, for all the good that you have done me. I'm quite finished now. Only one word more. How many times?" "Oh, Charles! Can't you see you're killing me? It's all ever so long ago. I've never given it a thought. Any one would say that you were positively trying to put those ideas into my head again. And then you'd be a lot better off," she concluded, with unconscious stupidity, but with intentional malice. "I only wished to know whether it had been since I knew you. It's only natural. Did it happen here, ever? You can't give me any particular evening, so that I can remind myself what I was doing at the time? You understand, surely, that it's not possible that you don't remember with whom, Odette, my love?" "But I don't know. Really, I don't. I think it was in the Bois, one evening when you came to meet us on the island. You had been dining with the Princesse de Lome," she added, happy to be able to furnish him with an exact detail which testified to her veracity. "At the next table there was a woman whom I hadn't seen for ever so long. She said to me, 'Come along, round behind the rock, there, and look at the moonlight on the water.' At first I just yawned and said, 'No, I'm too tired, and I'm quite happy where I am, thank you.' She swore there'd never been anything like it in the way of moonlight. 'I've heard that tale before,' I said to her. You see, I knew quite well what she was after." Odette narrated this episode almost as if it were a joke, either because it appeared to her to be quite natural, or because she thought that she was thereby minimizing its importance, or else so as not to appear ashamed. But, catching sight of Swann's face, she changed her tone, and, "You are a fiend!" she flung at him. "You enjoy tormenting me, making me tell you lies, just so that you'll leave me in peace." The second blow struck at Swann was even more excruciating than the first. Never had he supposed it to have been so recent an affair, hidden from his eyes that had been too innocent to discern it, not in a past which he had never known, but in evenings which he so well remembered, which he had lived through with Odette, of which he had supposed himself to have such an intimate, such an exhaustive knowledge, and which now assumed, retrospectively, an aspect of cunning and deceit and cruelty. In the midst of them parted suddenly a gaping chasm, that moment on the island in the Bois de Boulogne. Without being intelligent, Odette had the charm of being natural. She had recounted, she had acted the little scene with so much simplicity that Swann, as he gasped for breath, could vividly see it. Odette yawning, the rock there. She could hear her answer, alas, how light-heartedly, "I've heard that tale before." He felt that she would tell him nothing more that evening, that no further revelation was to be expected for the present. He was silent for a time, then said to her, "My poor darling, you must forgive me. I know I am hurting you dreadfully, but it's all over now. I shall never think of it again." But she saw that his eyes remained fixed upon the things that he did not know, and on that past era of their love, monotonous and soothing in his memory because it was vague, and now rent, as with a sword wound, by the news of that minute on the island in the Bois, by moonlight, while he was dining with the Princesse d'Erlon. But he had so far acquired the habit of finding life interesting, of marveling at the strange discoveries that there were to be made in it, that even while he was suffering so acutely that he did not believe it possible to endure such agony for any length of time, he was saying to himself, "Life is indeed astonishing, and holds some fine surprises. It appears that vice is far more common than one has been led to believe. Here is a woman in whom I had absolute confidence, who looks so simple, so honest, who in any case, even allowing that her morals are not strict, seem quite normal and healthy in her tastes and inclinations. I receive a most improbable accusation, I question her, and the little that she admits reveals far more than I could ever have suspected." But he could not confine himself to these detached observations. He sought to form an exact estimate of the importance of what she had just told him, so as to know whether he might conclude that she had done these things often, and was likely to do them again. He repeated her words to himself, "I knew quite well what she was after," 2 or 3 times. "I've heard that tale before." But they did not reappear in his memory unarmed; each of them held a knife with which it stabbed him afresh. For a long time, like a sick man who cannot restrain himself from attempting every minute to make the movement that he knows will hurt him, he kept on murmuring to himself, "I'm quite happy where I am, thank you. I've heard that tale before." But the pain was so intense that he was obliged to stop. He was amazed to find that actions which he had always hitherto judged so lightly, had dismissed indeed with a laugh, should have become as serious to him as a disease which might easily prove fatal. He knew any number of women whom he could ask to keep an eye on Odette, but how was he to expect them to adjust themselves to his new point of view, and not to remain at that which for so long had been his own, which had always guided him in his voluptuous existence, not to say to him with a smile, "You jealous monster, wanting to rob other people of their pleasure." By what trap door, suddenly lowered, had he, who had never found in the old days, in his love for Odette, any but the most refined of pleasures, been precipitated into this new circle of hell from which he could not see how he was ever to escape? Poor Odette! He wished her no harm. She was but half to blame. Had he not been told that it was her own mother who had sold her, when she was still little more than a child, at Nice, to a wealthy Englishman? But what an agonizing truth was now contained for him in those lines of Alfred de Vigny's Journal of a Poet, which he had previously read without emotion. When one feels oneself smitten by love for a woman, one ought to say to oneself, what are her surroundings? What has been her life? All one's future happiness lies in the answer. Swann was astonished that such simple phrases, spelt over in his mind as, "I've heard that tale before," or "I knew quite well what she was after," could cause him so much pain. But he realized that what he had mistaken for simple phrases were indeed parts of the panoply which held and could inflict on him the anguish that he had felt while Odette was telling her story, for it was the same anguish that he now was feeling afresh. It was no good his knowing now. Indeed, it was no good, as time went on, his having partly forgotten and altogether forgiven the offense. Whenever he repeated her words, his old anguish refashioned him as he had been before Odette began to speak. Ignorant, trustful, his merciless jealousy placed him once again, so that he might be effectively wounded by Odette's admission, in the position of a man who does not yet know the truth. And after several months this old story would still dumbfounder him like a sudden revelation. He marveled at the terrible recreative power of his memory. It was only by the weakening of that generative force, whose fecundity diminishes as age creeps over one, that he could hope for a relaxation of his torments. But, as soon as the power that any one of Odette's sentences had to make Swann suffer seemed to be nearly exhausted, lo and behold another, one of those to which he had hitherto paid least attention, almost a new sentence, came to relieve the first, and to strike at him with undiminished force. The memory of the evening on which he had dined with the Princesse d'Erlon was painful to him, but it was no more than the center, the core of his pain. That radiated vaguely round about it, overflowing into all the preceding and following days. And on whatever point in it he might intend his memory to rest, it was the whole of that season, during which the Verdurins had so often gone to dine upon the island in the Bois that sprang back to hurt him ; so violently that by slow degrees the curiosity which his jealousy was ever exciting in him was neutralized by his fear of the fresh tortures which he would be inflicting upon himself were he to satisfy it. He recognized that all the period of Odette's life which had elapsed before she first met him, a period of which he had never sought to form any picture in his mind, was not the featureless abstraction which he could vaguely see, but had consisted of so many definite, dated years, each crowded with concrete incidents. But were he to learn more of them, he feared lest her past, now colorless, fluid, and supportable, might assume a tangible, an obscene form, with individual and diabolical features. And he continued to refrain from seeking a conception of it, not any longer now from laziness of mind, but from fear of suffering. He hoped that some day he might be able to hear the island in the Bois or the Princesse d'Erlon mentioned without feeling any twinge of that old rending pain. Meanwhile he thought it imprudent to provoke Odette into furnishing him with fresh sentences, with the names of more places and people and of different events, which, when his malady was still scarcely healed, would make it break out again in another form. End of Part 3, Section 24.